In a village haunted by dark secrets and ancient curses, one woman's sleep becomes every man's nightmare. Adunni has always been different. Marked by tragedy and gifted with mysterious powers, she struggles to find her place in a world that shuns her. But when the men of her village begin waking up to a horrifying loss after each full moon, all fingers point to Adunni. As the villagers cry for blood, she finds herself on the run, desperate to prove her innocence. What they don't know is that Adunni is battling a curse far beyond her control. One that forces her, in her sleep, to cut the pride of every man in the village. With time running out and a death sentence hanging over her head, Adunni must unravel the dark secrets of her past and face the sinister forces that haunt her dreams. But as she uncovers the truth, Adunni realizes that the curse is not what it seems. Betrayed by those she trusted and hunted by the vengeful spirit of a sorceress, she must make an impossible choice: save the village that condemned her or sacrifice everything to break the cycle of vengeance. In this spellbinding tale of betrayal, family tragedy, and forbidden magic, Adunni's journey reveals that the line between love and hate is razor-thin, and sometimes, even the purest heart must confront the darkest secrets to find redemption. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The wind howled like a chorus of angry spirits, shaking the straw roofs of the village huts. Dark clouds swallowed the moon, casting the world into shadow. As the storm raged, a sense of dread seeped into every home. In this small, secluded village, fear had become as much a part of the air as the scent of wet earth. The full moon had risen once again, and everyone knew what that meant. A scream pierced the night. It came from the blacksmith's home at the far end of the village. Doors creaked open, and frightened villagers, holding flickering lanterns, poured into the muddy streets. Faces pale and eyes wide, they hurried toward the source of the commotion. The crowd reached the blacksmith's door just as his wife staggered out, her face a mask of terror. "He's been cursed," she wailed. "His manhood, it's gone." Her words sent a shiver through the gathered villagers. Whispers of witchcraft and dark magic rippled through the crowd, their voices filled with panic. Inside the dimly lit hut, the blacksmith lay sprawled on the floor, his face twisted in agony. He was clutching a blood-soaked cloth to his groin, eyes glazed with shock. The men who dared to step inside recoiled at the sight. No one had ever seen anything like it before, except for those who had lost their pride in the same horrific way during the past few moons. As the villagers murmured in terror, Chief Olayinka pushed his way to the front. His stern face was lined with age, but his eyes gleamed with a sharp, calculating light. "This must be the work of witchcraft," he declared, his voice steady yet commanding. "There is only one person who could do such a thing." The villagers turned as one toward a small hut on the outskirts of the village, where a dim light flickered behind shuttered windows. Adunni woke with a start, her heart pounding. Sweat drenched her clothes as if she had been running. Disoriented, she tried to recall what had happened, but her mind was a swirling fog. The nightmares had returned. In them, she had been in the darkness, cutting something with a knife, but she couldn't remember what it was. She rubbed her temples, trying to shake off the dreadful feeling. Before she could gather her thoughts, a loud banging at her door shattered the fragile silence. "Adunni," a voice shouted. "Come out." She froze. The nightmares, the screams, had she done something terrible again? She could barely remember falling asleep, let alone what happened afterward. But the accusing voices outside told her enough. The door burst open, and a group of villagers flooded in, led by Chief Olayinka. The cold night air rushed into the room, sending chills down her spine. "What's going on?" Adunni demanded, her voice trembling. Chief Olayinka pointed a finger at her. "Another man has been cursed tonight, and you were seen lurking near his home." The accusation hit her like a slap. I was asleep," Adunni stammered, trying to make sense of it. But the villagers weren't listening. The blacksmith's wife, wild-eyed and frantic, stepped forward. "Liar. I saw your shadow by our window just before he screamed." The crowd erupted into shouts, their torches blazing brighter against the darkness. Faces once familiar were now twisted with fear and hatred. "Witch," they cried, "you've brought this curse upon us." Adunni's heart pounded in her chest. "I swear I don't know what you're talking about," she pleaded, but it was no use. The fear had gripped the villagers, and there was no reasoning with them. Chief Olayinka's eyes gleamed as he raised his hand for silence. "Enough," he roared. "We cannot allow this to continue. Every full moon, another man suffers, and each time, the signs point to you, Adunni." A hush fell over the crowd. Adunni's mind raced, searching for a way to defend herself, but the fog from her nightmares still clung to her thoughts. Could she have done something without realizing it? The idea terrified her. The village elders stepped forward, their lined faces grim. "We will give you one last chance, Adunni," one of them declared. "3 more moons. If you do not stop this curse by then, we will have no choice but to take your life." Adunni's knees nearly buckled. 3 moons, she whispered. It was both a reprieve and a death sentence. How could she stop a curse she didn't even understand? Just as the villagers seemed ready to drag her away, a voice cut through the tension. "Wait." The crowd parted, revealing behind, a tall young man with kind eyes. "This is madness. You have no proof that Adunni is behind this," he argued, stepping in front of her protectively. "Let her speak. At least give her a chance to prove her innocence." Chief Olayinka scowled, but the elders nodded reluctantly. "Very well," one of them said. "But remember, Adunni, the clock is ticking." The villagers slowly dispersed, but their glares lingered on her like a stain. Kahin turned to Adunni, his voice low and urgent. "Meet me at the old well tonight," he whispered. "I believe you. But we need to find out who, or what, is truly behind this curse before it's too late." Adunni nodded, her mind spinning. She had 3 moons to solve a mystery that seemed impossible, and the entire village was against her. As she watched the villagers retreat, she couldn't shake the feeling that something even darker was at play. For now, though, she had to survive the night. And with the next full moon fast approaching, time was already running out. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, yet it did nothing to cool the simmering rage that hung over the village. Adunni hurried through the darkened paths, her heart racing as she made her way to the old well where Kahin had told her to meet him. Fear gnawed at her insides, not just from the villagers' threats, but from the growing suspicion that perhaps, just perhaps, the curse was truly tied to her in ways she didn't understand. Every shadow seemed to reach out for her, every whisper of the wind carrying echoes of witch and curse. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, glancing nervously behind her. Though the villagers had dispersed earlier, she could still feel their eyes on her, burning with suspicion and hatred. When she finally reached the clearing where the ancient well stood, she was breathless. The full moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the scene. The well's crumbling stones were covered in moss, and the air smelled damp and old, like secrets buried for centuries. "Kahin," she called softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. From behind the well, Kahin emerged, his face half hidden in shadow. Relief washed over Adunni as she saw him. At least someone still believed in her. But his expression was grim, his eyes searching the darkness around them. "We don't have much time," Kahin said urgently, moving closer. "I heard the elders talking after you left. Chief Olayinka is pressuring them to have you arrested even before the next full moon." Adunni's breath caught in her throat. "But they gave me 3 moons." She began, but Kahin shook his head. "Olayinka wants you gone. The villagers are scared, Adunni, and fear makes people do desperate things." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a worn parchment. "I found this in the chief's chambers." She unfolded the parchment with trembling hands, revealing strange symbols and words scrawled in a language she didn't recognize. At the top was a crude drawing of a woman bound in chains, surrounded by dark, jagged lines. "This is," she started. "It's a binding spell," Kahin explained. Olayinka's mother was known for her dark magic. "This curse, it's not just about cutting the men's pride. It's part of something much darker." Adunni's eyes widened. The connection to Olayinka's mother, the whispers of sorcery, it was all coming together. But why would they want to frame me? She asked, feeling a new surge of dread. Kahind hesitated, as if he were struggling with the weight of the information. Your father. He made a pact with the forest spirits, remember? Olayinka's family believes it's your family's fault that their power was lost. They think they can restore it by using you. Adunni felt the ground shift beneath her. Her father's pact, the curse, her nightmares, it was all connected. So, they're trying to use me to complete some kind of ritual? Kahind nodded. They need to harness your power. That's why the curse activates when you sleep. You're channeling their dark magic without even knowing it. Before she could process this revelation, a rustle in the bushes made them both freeze. Kahind grabbed Adunni's arm and pulled her behind the well just as a group of villagers stumbled into the clearing, torches blazing. There's no sign of her here, one of them muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. Chief Olayinka said she'd come this way. Search the forest, another commanded. The sooner we find that witch, the sooner we can end this madness. Adunni's heart pounded in her ears as she pressed herself against the cold stones of the well. Kahind held a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. The villagers' footsteps grew louder, their torches casting wild shadows that danced across the trees. When the search party finally moved on, Kahind let out a breath he had been holding. We need to leave the village, he whispered urgently. Find a way to break the curse before they find you. Adunni shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. I can't just run away. My mother, she's too sick to travel. If I leave, they'll take their anger out on her. Kahind's expression softened. We won't leave her behind. But first, we need to find answers. There's someone who might be able to help us, a seer who lives deep in the forest. Adunni nodded, wiping away her tears. Let's go, she whispered. She knew that with each passing night, the danger grew closer, and the full moon loomed like a blade over her neck. As they slipped back into the shadows, Adunni's thoughts were a tangled mess. The village she had once called home had turned against her. Her father's sins had come back to haunt her, and now, the only ally she had was a man who was risking everything to help her. But beneath it all, one question gnawed at her. Could she trust Kahind? Or was he, too, hiding secrets that could seal her fate? The journey through the forest was fraught with danger. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting the path into a web of shifting shadows. The only sounds were the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Kahind led the way with a torch, its dim light barely illuminating their path, while Adunni struggled to keep up, her mind reeling from everything she had learned. As they moved deeper into the forest, Adunni couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves made her jump, every snap of a twig sent her heart racing. The villagers' anger, the revelation about her father's pact, and the strange symbols on the parchment, they all swirled in her mind like a storm. Are you sure this seer can help us? Adunni asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Kahind glanced back at her, his expression tense but determined. If anyone knows how to break a curse, it's her, he replied. She lives far beyond the village, where even the bravest hunters dare not go. But we don't have any other choice. Adunni nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. Every step they took was a step further from her ailing mother, and the weight of leaving her behind pressed heavily on her heart. But if Kahind was right, this was their only chance to end the nightmare before it consumed them all. After what felt like hours of trekking through the dense forest, they reached a clearing bathed in moonlight. At its center stood a small, crooked hut, its roof covered in moss and vines. The air around it was thick with the scent of herbs and incense. A strange stillness hung in the air, as if the very forest held its breath. Kahind stopped just outside the clearing, turning to Adunni. Listen, he said in a low voice. This seer is different. She sees beyond what is visible, but her help comes with a price. You must be careful with your words. Adunni nodded, swallowing hard. She could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her, and exhaustion gnawed at her bones. But she had to push forward. The lives of everyone she loved depended on it. Kahind approached the door and knocked softly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door creaked open, revealing an old woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's. Her face was lined with age, her hair a wild mess of gray strands, and she wore a tattered robe that smelled of earth and smoke. "I've been expecting you," the seer said, her voice rasping like dry leaves. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the darkness of the hut, leaving the door ajar. Adunni exchanged a wary glance with Kahind, who nodded for her to follow. Together, they stepped inside, the heavy scent of herbs enveloping them. The interior was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting strange shadows on the walls lined with dried plants, bones, and jars filled with mysterious substances. "Sit," the seer commanded, motioning to a pair of rickety stools. As they obeyed, she shuffled around a wooden table, her eyes never leaving Adunni. "You carry a darkness within you, girl. A curse bound to your blood." Adunni's throat tightened. "I need to know how to break it," she pleaded. "The men in my village, they're being—" "I know what the curse does," the seer interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "The question is, do you know why it was placed on your family?" Adunni's eyes darted to Kahind, who looked just as confused as she felt. "My father, he made a pact with the spirits to protect the village," Adunni began. "But I don't understand why it affects me now." The seer let out a harsh laugh, her eyes glinting with something between pity and malice. "Your father's pact was not to protect the village. It was to protect himself at your expense. The spirits demanded a life, and he offered yours as payment." Adunni's heart seemed to stop. "No, that can't be true," she whispered, her voice trembling. But even as she said it, pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The nightmares, the villagers' accusations, the feeling of being controlled, it all began to make a horrifying kind of sense. Kahind's face darkened. "Is there any way to break the curse?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. The seer's eyes narrowed as she studied them both. "There is, but it will not be easy," she said slowly. "The curse feeds on hatred and anger. As long as you harbor those feelings, girl, it will continue to control you. You must let go of the pain that binds you to the past." Adunni shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "How can I forgive those who betrayed my family? How can I forgive my father for what he did to me?" The seer leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because if you don't, the curse will consume you completely. And when it does, you will do far worse than simply cutting the pride of men. You will become a vessel for the dark magic that fuels it." Adunni's tears spilled over. How could she let go of the pain that had shaped her life? How could she forgive the father who had doomed her to this nightmare? "There is one other way," the seer added, her eyes glittering with a dark promise. "But it is a path filled with danger. You must find the source of the curse, the one who cast it, and destroy them. Only then can you be free." Kahind leaned forward, his eyes burning with determination. "We'll do it. Whatever it takes." The seer smiled, but it was a cold, knowing smile that sent chills down Adunni's spine. "Be warned," she said. "The one you seek is closer than you think. And when the time comes, you will have to decide what matters more, your freedom or your soul." Before Adunni could respond, the seer reached out and grasped her wrist, her bony fingers like iron. "Remember, child, time is running out. The next full moon is closer than you think. If you fail, you will lose far more than the trust of your village. You will lose yourself." The old woman released her grip, and just like that, the oppressive air inside the hut seemed to lift. Adunni felt as if she had been released from a spell. "Now go," the seer commanded, "before the shadows find you." As they hurried back into the forest, Adunni's mind was spinning with the seer's words. The one who had cast the curse was closer than she had realized. But who could it be? And how could she possibly find them before it was too late? Kahind glanced at her as they made their way back through the forest. "We have our answer now, but it's up to us to figure out the rest," he said softly. Adunni nodded, her resolve hardening. She would find the one responsible, even if it meant facing her darkest fears. The ticking clock of the next full moon loomed over her like a shadow, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. For now, she had a plan. And in a world where she could trust no one, that was more than she had before. The sun was just beginning to rise as Adunni and Kahind emerged from the forest, exhaustion etched on their faces. The village was quiet, with only the faint sound of roosters crowing in the distance. As they approached the outskirts of the village, they kept to the shadows, wary of being seen. The night's revelations weighed heavily on them, especially on Adunni, whose mind was racing with everything the seer had revealed. "I have to see my mother," Adunni whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "If what the seer said is true, then she might know more about my father's pact." Kahind nodded, understanding her urgency. "I'll stay here and keep watch. If the villagers find out we've returned, they'll turn on you before you can get any answers." Adunni squeezed his hand gratefully before slipping away, heading toward the small, run-down hut she called home. The morning light was faint, casting long shadows over the village, but it was enough for her to avoid being seen. As she approached her mother's home, her heart tightened. The thought of what she might learn terrified her, but she knew it was the only way to break the curse. When she stepped inside, she was greeted by the familiar scent of herbs and smoke. Her mother lay on a straw mat, her once strong frame now frail and weak. The sight of her mother in such a state brought tears to Adunni's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She didn't have time to dwell on her sorrow. "Mother," Adunni whispered, kneeling beside her. "I need to ask you something about father." Her mother's eyes fluttered open, clouded with sickness, but still filled with love. "Adunni, my child," she murmured, reaching out a trembling hand. What troubles you?" Adunni swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "The curse, mother. It's getting worse. I met with a seer, and she told me that father made a pact, but that it was to protect himself, not the village. Is it true? Did he trade my life for his own?" Her mother's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked more alive than she had in months. "Who told you this?" she whispered, her voice filled with fear. "It doesn't matter," Adunni pressed. "I need to know the truth. Did father really betray me?" Her mother closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes," she finally admitted, her voice breaking. "Your father was desperate. The village was suffering, crops failing, children falling ill. The spirits demanded a sacrifice. He thought by giving them you, he could save us all." Adunni's heart shattered at her mother's words. She had always suspected that her father's pact had been more than just a simple deal with the spirits, but hearing it confirmed left her feeling hollow inside. "How could he?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How could he do this to me?" Her mother reached for her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "He loved you, Adunni. But he was a weak man, a coward. He believed it was the only way to save the village. He never imagined it would turn into this." Adunni pulled her hand away, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Love? If he loved me, he wouldn't have sacrificed my soul to the darkness." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but before she could say more, a loud banging came from the door. "Adunni, open up." Adunni's heart leapt into her throat. She turned to her mother, who nodded weakly. "Go, my child. Hide yourself. They must not find you." Without another word, Adunni slipped out through the back of the hut, her heart pounding. As she crouched behind the hut, listening to the angry voices, she knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She had to find the one who had truly cast the curse, the one who was using her as a pawn in their dark game. Adunni made her way back to Kahind, who was waiting anxiously near the edge of the forest. "What did you find out?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. "It's worse than I thought," she replied, her voice hollow. "The seer was right. My father sacrificed me to save himself and the village. But there's more. Someone else is manipulating the curse to their own ends. We have to find them before the next full moon." Kahind nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "We'll figure it out together. But for now, we need to move. The villagers are searching for you." As they hurried back into the forest, Adunni couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. The curse was tightening its grip on her, and she knew that if they didn't find the one responsible soon, she would lose more than just her freedom. She would lose herself completely to the darkness. They didn't stop until they were deep in the forest, where the shadows were thick enough to hide them from any prying eyes. There, they paused to catch their breath, the weight of everything they had learned pressing down on them like a heavy stone. Kahind turned to her, his expression softening. I know it's hard to hear, but we can't dwell on the past now. We have to focus on breaking this curse. Adunni nodded, wiping the tears from her eyes. You're right. But the seer said the one who cast the curse is closer than we think. Who could it be? Kahind hesitated, his jaw tightening. There's one person who's always been close to the village, who's always had a hidden hand in its affairs. Chief Alayinka. Adunni's eyes widened as the pieces began to fit together. The strange symbols Kahind had found in Alayinka's chambers, his obsession with finding and punishing her, and his family's dark connection to the sorceress, could he be the one manipulating the curse? We need to confront him, Adunni said, her voice hardening with resolve. But we have to be careful. If he suspects we're onto him, he'll kill us before we get the chance. Kahind nodded. We'll wait until the full moon, when his guard is down. That's when we'll strike. As they made their plans, the moon rose higher in the sky, casting a silver light over the forest. The clock was ticking, and with each passing moment, the curse grew stronger. But Adunni was no longer running. She was ready to fight. The hunt for the truth had begun, and she would stop at nothing to find it, even if it meant facing the darkest secrets of her past. The shadows of the forest deepened as Adunni and Kahind pressed forward, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves beneath them. The further they ventured from the village, the darker and more foreboding the forest became. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, cloying aroma of night-blooming flowers. It was a place where sunlight rarely penetrated, leaving it perpetually shrouded in twilight. The journey ahead was treacherous, but there was no turning back now. We're getting close, Kahind said, his voice hushed, as if afraid the trees themselves might be listening. The spirits are known to haunt these woods. We must tread carefully. Adunni nodded, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth for any sign of movement. The forest was rumored to be a place where few dared to tread, where those who entered often never returned. Yet, it was here that they hoped to find the answers that would break the curse. According to the seer, the spirits that dwelled in this forest held the key to understanding the dark magic that had ensnared her. The silence around them was unnatural, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Adunni's senses were on high alert, her heart racing with both fear and determination. She couldn't afford to fail, not when the full moon was less than 2 weeks away. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a clearing bathed in faint moonlight. At the center stood an ancient, twisted tree, its roots like serpents coiling around the ground. Kahind stopped, holding out his arm to halt Adunni. This is it, he whispered. The tree of spirits. This is where we must call upon them. Adunni swallowed hard, remembering the warnings the seer had given them. The spirits were capricious, easily offended, and quick to punish those who came unprepared. But they were also known for their knowledge of the unseen, and if there was any hope of breaking the curse, it lay here. Kahind reached into his satchel and pulled out a small bundle of herbs, a gift for the spirits, as the seer had instructed. He scattered the herbs around the base of the tree and began to chant softly in a language Adunni couldn't understand. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind whispering through the leaves like voices from another world. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a chill ran down Adunni's spine as the ground beneath her feet trembled. A ghostly light flickered around the tree, and the air was filled with the scent of something ancient and wild. Shadows moved among the branches, taking shape, and Adunni realized with a start that they were not alone. Figures began to materialize around them, translucent shapes with eyes that glowed like embers. The spirits hovered silently, their faces twisted with emotions that were impossible to read. Adunni's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories of these spirits, how they delighted in toying with mortals. Now, standing before them, she felt like a small, fragile thing beneath their gaze. One of the spirits, taller and more solid than the others, stepped forward. Its form shimmered like mist, constantly shifting. "Why have you come here, daughter of the broken pact?" its voice echoed, as though coming from all directions at once. Adunni took a deep breath, summoning all her courage. "I seek to break the curse that binds me," she said. "The curse that steals the lives of the men in my village. I was told you hold the knowledge I need." The spirit's eyes narrowed, and it let out a sound that could have been laughter or a hiss. "Your father's sins are the source of your suffering," it said. "He struck a bargain he did not keep. Now, the debt falls upon you." Adunni's fists clenched at her sides. "I am not my father," she said through gritted teeth. "Tell me how to end this, and I will do whatever is necessary." The spirits murmured among themselves, their whispers like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Finally, the lead spirit spoke again. "The curse feeds on your anger and pain, child. As long as you hold hatred in your heart, it will continue to consume you. But there is another way, a path that requires a sacrifice." Adunni's heart sank. "What kind of sacrifice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must find the one who cast the curse upon you," the spirit replied. "Only by destroying their power can you be free. But beware, the one you seek is hidden, even among those you trust." Kahin stepped forward, his voice urgent. "How can we find them? Time is running out." The spirit turned its gaze upon him, its eyes glowing brighter. "The one you seek is closer than you think, hiding behind a mask of friendship. You must open your eyes, or you will remain a pawn in their game." Adunni's mind whirled with confusion. Someone she trusted? Could it be one of the villagers? Or even Kahin? The thought sent a cold shiver through her, but she quickly pushed it aside. Kahin had risked everything to help her. She couldn't afford to doubt him now. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "We will find the one responsible." The spirit nodded slowly. "Be warned," it said. "The next full moon will bring the curse to its peak. Fail to break it by then, and you will be lost to darkness forever." Before Adunni could respond, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night like smoke. The air around them grew warm again, and the oppressive weight that had filled the clearing lifted. Adunni let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. Kahin put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We have a lead now," he said, his voice firm. "But we must be careful. The spirits' words are often riddles. We can't trust everything they say." Adunni nodded, though her mind was still reeling. Someone close to her was behind the curse? Who could it be? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than she had imagined. As they made their way back through the forest, a new resolve filled her. She would find the one who had condemned her to this cursed fate. But with the full moon drawing nearer, she knew that every step they took brought them closer to a confrontation that could cost them everything. For now, all they could do was prepare for the battle ahead. The curse was growing stronger, and time was running out. The forest seemed darker and more oppressive than before as Adunni and Kahin made their way back toward the village. The spirit's cryptic warning echoed in Adunni's mind. "The one you seek is hidden, even among those you trust." The words gnawed at her, planting seeds of doubt. Could the enemy truly be someone close to her? Someone she had counted on for support? As they reached the edge of the forest, the village came into view, cloaked in the dim light of dusk. The thatched roofs of the huts looked like hunched figures, silently watching them. The air was thick with tension. The curse had been growing worse with each passing night, and the villagers were on edge. Kahin turned to Adunni, his eyes filled with concern. "We need to be careful," he whispered. "The villagers are becoming desperate. If they catch even a hint of what we're planning, they'll turn on you before we have a chance to stop this." Adunni nodded, her jaw set with determination. "We don't have much time," she replied. "The full moon is only a week away. If we don't find the one behind this curse soon, I'll be lost." As they approached her mother's hut, Adunni's heart sank. A crowd had gathered outside, their angry murmurs growing louder as they noticed her and Kahin approaching. At the center of the crowd stood Chief Alayinka, his arms crossed over his chest, a self-satisfied smirk on his lips. "There she is," a voice shouted. "The witch returns to finish her dark work." Adunni tried to push through the crowd, but rough hands shoved her back. Chief Alayinka raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. "Adunni," he said in a tone that was almost mocking, "we were just discussing your misdeeds. The blacksmith is not recovering, and now another man has fallen victim to your curse." Adunni's eyes widened in shock. "That's impossible," she protested. "I've been in the forest all night. I didn't do anything." Chief Alayinka stepped closer, his gaze cold and calculating. "Perhaps not with your hands, but with your magic. Do you really expect us to believe that you are innocent when men are losing their manhoods every night?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The villagers, driven by fear and anger, were ready to tear her apart. But before they could act, Kahin stepped forward, placing himself between Adunni and the mob. "Enough," he shouted. "Accusing her without proof will solve nothing. You're letting fear cloud your judgment." Chief Alayinka's eyes narrowed at Kahin, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "You defend her, Kahin, but for how long? How many more men must suffer before we put an end to this curse?" Kahin held his ground, his voice steady. "I believe Adunni is innocent. There's more to this curse than we understand. The spirits themselves have confirmed it." The mention of spirits caused a stir among the villagers, but Chief Alayinka merely laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Spirits? Or perhaps the whisperings of a witch trying to save her own skin?" Adunni could feel the panic rising in her chest. The villagers were on the verge of turning into a mob. Desperate to defuse the situation, she raised her voice. "If you truly believe I am the source of this curse, then let me prove my innocence," she declared. "Give me until the next full moon. If I cannot lift the curse by then, I will surrender myself willingly." Chief Alayinka seemed to consider this, his eyes glinting with a strange light. "Very well," he said after a long pause. "You have until the next full moon. But if one more man falls victim, we will not wait. Your life will be forfeit." With that, he turned and walked away, the crowd slowly dispersing. Kahin let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and turned to Adunni. "That was dangerous," he muttered. "But you bought us some time." Adunni nodded, her mind already racing with thoughts of their next move. "We need to get back to my mother," she said. "She may know something that can help us find the source of the curse." Inside the small, dimly lit hut, Adunni's mother was sitting up, her eyes bright with fever. She looked even weaker than before, her breathing shallow. "Mother," Adunni said softly, kneeling beside her, "I need your help. The curse is getting worse. Do you know anything about the sorceress who was tied to Father's pact?" Her mother's eyes flickered with recognition, and she nodded slowly. "The sorceress, she was once one of us," she rasped, her voice barely audible. "But when your father broke his promise, she swore vengeance. She hid among the villagers, waiting for the right moment to strike." Adunni's heart skipped a beat. "Hid among the villagers," she repeated. "Do you know who she is?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head weakly. "I do not know her face, but she was close to your father. Closer than anyone knew." Adunni's mind raced. Someone who had been close to her father, who had been hiding in plain sight. Could it be Chief Alayinka, or someone else entirely? The pieces were starting to come together, but she still needed more information. Before she could press her mother for more answers, there was a sudden crash at the door. Adunni and Kahin spun around to see a figure in a dark cloak standing in the doorway. The flickering light from the hearth cast long shadows across the figure's face, obscuring their features. "You've meddled for too long, Adunni," the figure hissed, their voice laced with malice. "It's time to end this." In an instant, the cloaked figure lunged at them, a glint of steel in their hand. Kahin moved swiftly, grabbing a pot from the table and hurling it at the attacker. The figure stumbled back, giving Adunni just enough time to grab a knife from her belt. With a roar of defiance, Adunni slashed at the figure, catching their cloak and tearing it away. The hood fell back, revealing a face she never expected to see, one of the village elders who had always been kind to her. "You," Adunni whispered, her voice shaking. "You've been the one behind this all along?" The elders sneered, their eyes gleaming with madness. "Your father's betrayal cursed us all, and now you will pay the price," they spat. "You were supposed to be the vessel for the sorceress's power, but you've grown too strong. That ends tonight." Before Adunni could react, the elder raised their hands, chanting words in a language she didn't understand. The air around them crackled with dark energy, and Adunni felt herself being pulled toward the elder by an unseen force. "Run, Adunni!" Kahind shouted, shoving her toward the back door. "I'll hold them off." Adunni hesitated for a split second, torn between staying to help and escaping to find answers. But she knew that if she didn't leave now, they would both be captured, or worse. With a final, desperate glance at Kahind, she turned and fled into the night, her heart pounding. As she disappeared into the shadows of the forest, Adunni knew that time was running out. The full moon was only days away, and now she knew for certain that the curse was tied to a deeper conspiracy. But with Kahind left behind to face the enemy alone, she was more vulnerable than ever. She had to find a way to break the curse and save the village before it was too late. But first, she needed to discover who the true puppet master was and why they were so desperate to see her destroyed. Adunni ran through the dense forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, casting a faint glow that barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees above. Every rustle in the bushes sent her heart racing. Every shadow seemed to reach for her. The revelation that one of the village elders, someone she had trusted, was behind the curse left her shaken to the core. Her mind was spinning. Who could she trust now? Kahind had stayed behind to fend off the elder, risking his life to protect her. But what if he was also hiding secrets? The spirit's warning echoed in her ears. The one you seek is closer than you think, hiding behind a mask of friendship. Finally, she slowed to a stop beside a large, moss-covered rock, collapsing against it as her legs gave way. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she struggled to catch her breath. The weight of everything was crushing her. Her father's betrayal, the villagers' hatred, the curse that was slowly consuming her. She felt like she was drowning. As she sat there, alone in the darkness, the forest seemed to close in around her. The memories of her mother's dying words replayed in her mind. The sorceress was once close to your father. Closer than anyone knew. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Who was truly behind this curse, and why had they chosen her to bear the burden? A twig snapped behind her, and Adunni's head jerked up, eyes wide. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things, but then a figure emerged from the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the familiar silhouette. It was Kahind, looking worse for wear, his clothes torn and blood-stained, but otherwise unharmed. "Kahind," she cried, relief flooding through her as she rushed to him. "You made it out." He nodded, but his face was grim. "I managed to escape, but the elder won't give up that easily. We don't have much time, Adunni. The full moon is only days away." Adunni pulled back, searching his eyes. "Did you learn anything? Who is behind this? Why are they so desperate to keep me bound by this curse?" Kahind hesitated, his gaze flickering to the ground. The elder mentioned that the curse was meant to transfer power to someone else, he said slowly. But they didn't say who. Adunni's heart sank. The more she learned, the more complicated it became. "We have to figure this out," she whispered. "If we don't." Before she could finish her sentence, she noticed the way Kahind's eyes darted around, avoiding her gaze. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in her stomach. "Kahind, are you hiding something from me?" Kahind stiffened, his jaw clenching. "No, of course not," he said, too quickly. But the flicker of hesitation in his eyes told a different story. Adunni's mind flashed back to the spirit's warning, and suddenly, everything seemed to click into place. She stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "You were there when I was accused. You've been helping me, but how do I know you're not part of this too?" Kahind's face twisted with hurt, but there was something else there too, fear. Adunni, you know me. I've risked everything to protect you. But have you? She shot back, her voice rising. The spirit said the one responsible is someone close to me. How do I know it isn't you? For a moment, Kahind's expression hardened. Then, he sighed heavily, shoulders slumping. You're right, he said softly, looking down. I haven't been entirely honest with you. Adunni's heart lurched. What do you mean? Kahind looked up, his eyes filled with pain. I didn't want you to find out like this, but I was trying to protect you. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. I was sent by Chief Alayinka to spy on you. Adunni stumbled back, the ground seeming to shift beneath her feet. You, what? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Kahind's eyes were pleading. I didn't know the full extent of what he was planning. At first, I thought he was just trying to protect the village. But then I learned the truth. That the curse was meant to drain your life force, to restore the power of the sorceress. Adunni's mind reeled. So, all this time, you were working for him? You were lying to me. At first, yes, Kahind admitted, his voice breaking. But I swear, Adunni, once I realized what he was really doing, I couldn't go through with it. That's why I've been helping you. I care about you. Adunni shook her head, tears streaming down her face. How can I believe you now? After everything? Kahind stepped closer, his eyes desperate. Please, you have to trust me. I can prove my loyalty. I know where Alayinka is keeping the sorceress's artifacts, the ones that fuel the curse. If we destroy them, we can break the curse for good. Adunni hesitated, torn between her anger and the faint hope that Kahind might be telling the truth. How do I know this isn't another trick? She asked, her voice shaking. Kahind met her gaze, his eyes filled with sincerity. Because if I was still working for Alayinka, I wouldn't be standing here, telling you all of this. I would have turned you in when I had the chance. Adunni stared at him for a long moment, searching his eyes for any sign of deception. Finally, she nodded, though the knot of distrust in her chest refused to loosen completely. Fine, she said. But if you betray me again, I won't, Kahind promised. I swear it. As they turned to leave, Adunni's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The revelation of Kahind's betrayal, and his claim that he had switched sides, had left her reeling. But there was no time to dwell on it now. The full moon was approaching, and if they didn't act quickly, she would lose any chance of breaking the curse and saving herself. With each step deeper into the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into another trap. But for now, Kahind was her only ally, and she had no choice but to trust him, at least until she found out the truth for herself. As they made their way toward the hidden chamber where Alayinka kept his secrets, Adunni couldn't help but wonder, was Kahind truly on her side, or was this just another layer in a web of deceit? The only thing she knew for certain was that the clock was ticking. The full moon was just days away, and time was running out. The village square was alive with a flurry of activity, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats, flowers, and incense. It was as if a festival had taken over, but the atmosphere was tense and desperate. Adunni stood at the edge of the square, her heart pounding as she watched the villagers scurrying around, preparing for a wedding that she never agreed to. Her wedding. After the dramatic confrontation with the elder in her mother's hut, Adunni and Kahind had returned to the village under the cover of darkness. But Chief Alayinka's spies had been watching, and they were captured as soon as they set foot near the village center. Adunni now found herself caught in a new nightmare, one she never could have imagined. The villagers, desperate to stop the curse before the full moon, had latched onto a twisted belief that only a wedding to her soulmate could break the curse. Adunni was to be married off to Kahind in a hastily arranged ceremony. The elders insisted that this union, sealed by the spirit's blessing, was the only way to end the curse that had plagued their village. Adunni stood beside Kahind in the middle of the square, her wrists bound with ceremonial ropes. Villagers surrounded them, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The air buzzed with nervous anticipation. She could see Chief Olayinka standing at the front, his gaze fixed on her with a triumphant gleam in his eyes. Kahind leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to go along with this, Adunni. If we resist, they'll kill us both." Adunni shot him a glare, her voice laced with bitterness. "How can I trust you, Kahind? You've already betrayed me once." Kahind's eyes softened with pain. "I know I don't deserve your trust. But right now, this is our only chance. We need to play along until we can find a way out." The crowd erupted into cheers as the village elder stepped forward, dressed in elaborate robes and holding a staff adorned with feathers and beads. He raised his hands to silence the villagers. "Today, we gather to unite Adunni and Kahind, in the hope that their bond will lift the curse that has brought our village to its knees," he announced. Adunni's stomach churned. This was madness. A sham wedding to break a curse? It sounded like something out of a folktale, yet here she was, being paraded before the village like a lamb to the slaughter. She glanced around, desperately searching for an escape, but the square was surrounded by guards armed with spears. There was no way out. As the elder began the ceremonial chant, Kahind squeezed her hand. "Trust me," he whispered. "I have a plan." Adunni didn't respond. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on the elder's droning voice, trying to drown out the chaos in her mind. Was this truly her only option? To be bound to a man she wasn't sure she could trust, all for the sake of a village that wanted her dead? The elder approached them, holding a bowl filled with a dark, thick liquid. "With this sacred binding, your spirits will be united," he intoned, dipping his fingers into the bowl and smearing the liquid onto their foreheads. The scent of blood and herbs made Adunni's stomach turn. "Let the spirits witness your union and break the curse that plagues our land." But just as the elder was about to place the ceremonial wreath on Adunni's head, she suddenly felt a wave of dizziness. The world around her spun, and her vision blurred. The curse was taking hold again. "No, not now," she whispered, her voice weak. Her body betrayed her, her knees buckling as she collapsed to the ground. The villagers gasped, murmuring among themselves as Adunni's eyes glazed over. She could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat, deafening in her ears. Everything felt distant, as if she were slipping into another realm. The curse was stronger than ever, clawing at her mind, trying to force her into the dark, uncontrollable state where she would lash out and harm those around her. She couldn't let it take over, not now, not in front of everyone. But it was too late. In a horrifying trance, Adunni found herself moving without control, her hand reaching for a knife that had been placed on the ceremonial altar. The villagers screamed as she grabbed the blade, her eyes wild and unseeing. It was as if she were possessed, her body moving of its own accord. Kahind acted fast. He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist just as she was about to plunge the knife into the elder. "Adunni! Fight it," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Adunni struggled, her mind a storm of confusion and rage. For a moment, the fog lifted, and she saw Kahind's face, etched with fear and concern. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, trying to hold on to herself. "Kahind." He tightened his grip on her wrist. "Stay with me, Adunni. You're stronger than this curse. You can fight it." With a guttural scream, Adunni wrenched herself free from the curse's grip. The knife clattered to the ground, and she collapsed, gasping for air. The villagers stared in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Chief Olayinka stepped forward, his face a mask of fury. "This is proof," he roared. "She is possessed. The curse will not end until she is sacrificed." "No!" Kahind shouted, standing protectively in front of Adunni. "She can still break the curse. We just need more time." The elders exchanged worried glances, but the crowd was already turning into a frenzied mob. They surged forward, screaming for Adunni's blood. The guards closed in, their spears pointed at her. Realizing they were out of time, Kahind grabbed Adunni's arm. "Run," he hissed. "Now!" Adunni didn't need to be told twice. She stumbled to her feet, her mind still foggy from the curse's influence, and sprinted after Kahind. The villagers shouted in rage, but the crowd was too chaotic for the guards to follow them immediately. They darted down narrow alleys and through twisting paths, the sounds of the mob growing fainter with each step. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest, plunging into the shadows where the villagers dared not follow. Panting, Adunni leaned against a tree, her entire body shaking. "We can't keep running like this," she gasped. "They'll hunt us down." Kahind turned to her, his expression grim but determined. "We don't have a choice. We need to find those artifacts and destroy them. It's the only way to break the curse." Adunni nodded, her resolve hardening. The wedding was a sham, a desperate attempt by the villagers to find a solution that didn't exist. But she was done being a pawn in their game. The only way to end this nightmare was to face it head-on. With the full moon only days away, they had no time to waste. Together, they vanished into the depths of the forest, determined to find the source of the curse and put an end to it once and for all. The forest closed in around Adunni and Kahind as they ran deeper into its shadows, the echoes of the villagers' shouts slowly fading behind them. The dense trees and thick underbrush seemed to swallow the last traces of moonlight, leaving only the faintest slivers of silver to guide their way. Exhausted but driven by desperation, they didn't stop until the sounds of the village were completely drowned out by the forest's eerie silence. Adunni stumbled to a halt, clutching a stitch in her side, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. I can't. Keep running," she panted, leaning heavily against a tree. Kahind nodded, his face grim but determined. "We need to keep moving, but we can rest for a moment." He kept a vigilant watch, scanning the forest around them. "They'll search for us, but they won't venture too far into these woods. Not with the stories of the spirits." Adunni sank to the ground, trying to calm her racing heart. The events of the last few hours were a chaotic blur in her mind, the wedding that had turned into a nightmare, the curse taking control of her once again, and Kahind's desperate attempts to save her. It was all too much. She looked up at Kahind, who was standing guard, his expression tense. Despite everything, he had stayed by her side. But could she truly trust him after his earlier betrayal? The doubt gnawed at her, refusing to let go. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Kahind," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "you told me you were sent by Chief Alayinka to spy on me. But you never told me why. What does he want with me?" Kahind turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. He crouched down beside her, lowering his voice as if the trees themselves were listening. "I didn't know the full extent of his plans when he sent me to watch you," he confessed. "At first, I thought he was just trying to protect the village from the curse. But then I realized he's after something much darker." Adunni's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her suspicion growing. "Tell me everything." Kahind sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Alayinka believes that the power behind the curse can be harnessed. He wants to use it to restore his family's influence, to gain control over the entire region. The curse was never just about punishing your father's betrayal, it was a way for Alayinka to seize power." Adunni's mind reeled. "But why me? Why am I the one who's cursed?" Kahind's expression darkened. "Because of the pact your father made with the spirits. The sorceress he betrayed was once allied with Alayinka's family. When your father broke his promise, the sorceress swore vengeance, not just on him but on anyone with his blood. She knew that your powers would manifest when you came of age. Alayinka wants to control that power, to use you as a vessel to complete the ritual and take the sorceress's place." Adunni's blood ran cold. "He wants to possess me? To turn me into a weapon?" she whispered, horrified. Kahind nodded grimly. "Yes. That's why he pushed for the wedding. If he could bind you to him through the ritual, he could siphon the curse's power and control it." Adunni's breath caught in her throat. "And you? Were you helping him with that?" Kahind's eyes filled with pain. "At first, yes. But when I learned what he truly intended to do to you, I couldn't go through with it. That's why I turned against him. I didn't know how deep the sorceress's magic ran, but I knew that if he succeeded, you'd be lost forever." Adunni looked away, her mind racing with a mix of emotions: anger, betrayal, fear, and a flicker of something that felt like hope. "Then why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Why wait until now?" Kahind's shoulders slumped. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd push me away. And I need you to trust me, Adunni. Because I believe we can still stop him." Adunni studied his face, searching for any hint of deception. But all she saw was exhaustion and a kind of raw honesty that she hadn't seen before. Could she really trust him? Did she even have a choice? "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice quiet but resolute. Kahind's eyes flashed with determination. "The artifacts," he said. "The ones that Alayinka uses to channel the sorceress's power. They're hidden in an old temple deep within the forest. If we destroy them, we can break the curse at its source." Adunni's heart quickened. "But how do we get there? The forest is vast, and we're running out of time." Kahind reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, tattered map. "I stole this from Alayinka's chambers before I left. It shows the way to the temple. But it's not going to be easy. The temple is guarded by the spirits, and they won't let us pass without a fight." Adunni took the map, her fingers trembling slightly. This was it, their only chance to end this nightmare. "Then we have to move quickly," she said, determination hardening her voice. "We have only a few days before the full moon. If we don't break the curse before then." Kahind nodded. "We'll do it. Together." For a moment, there was a fragile silence between them, a silent truce forged in the crucible of desperation. Adunni wasn't sure if she fully trusted Kahind, but for now, they were bound by a common goal. As they set off deeper into the forest, guided by the faint light of the moon and the map in Kahind's hands, Adunni couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The forest was unnaturally silent, as if the very air was holding its breath. The deeper they ventured, the more Adunni's unease grew. The forest around them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the shadows shifting like living creatures. She glanced at Kahind, who was focused on the map, his expression tense. "Kahind," she said quietly, "if this is another trick." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I swear to you, Adunni, I want to stop Alayinka as much as you do. But we have to stay strong. The spirits will try to turn us against each other." Adunni nodded, though the doubt still gnawed at her. She had no choice but to keep moving forward, to trust that this path would lead to the answers she so desperately needed. As they trudged through the underbrush, the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate, as if something ancient and powerful was stirring beneath the soil. The air grew colder, and the trees around them seemed to whisper secrets she couldn't quite hear. Finally, they reached the entrance to the temple, a dark, foreboding structure half buried in the earth, with ancient carvings that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Kahind turned to her, his face pale but resolute. "This is it," he said. "Once we enter, there's no turning back." Adunni took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She could feel the curse tightening its grip on her, the darkness threatening to consume her mind. But she wouldn't let it win. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. "We end this tonight." Together, they stepped into the darkness of the temple, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them within. The ancient temple loomed before them, half consumed by the forest. Vines crawled up its crumbling stone walls, and strange, glowing runes pulsed faintly in the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old magic, making every breath feel heavy. Adunni's heart pounded as she and Kahind approached the temple's entrance. This was it, their last chance to break the curse before the full moon rose again. "We need to move quickly," Kahind whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. "The artifacts that power the curse are inside. If we destroy them, we can sever the sorceress's connection and free you." Adunni nodded, gripping the knife she had taken from the village altar. The weight of everything that had happened, her father's betrayal, the villagers' accusations, Kahind's shifting loyalties, pressed down on her, but she pushed it aside. Right now, she needed to focus. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. Together, they slipped into the temple's shadowed entrance. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of ancient decay. Flickering torches cast wavering light on the walls, revealing carvings of twisted faces and scenes of rituals long forgotten. Each step they took echoed eerily, as if the very walls were whispering secrets they were not meant to hear. Adunni's pulse quickened. The oppressive energy inside the temple seemed to claw at her skin, urging her to turn back. But she clenched her jaw and pushed forward. The full moon was only hours away, and if they failed tonight, she would be lost to the curse forever. As they rounded a corner, the hallway opened into a vast chamber illuminated by a sickly green glow. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, covered in strange markings. On it rested several ancient relics, a blood-stained dagger, a twisted wooden staff, and a bowl filled with a dark, viscous liquid that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air around the altar shimmered with dark magic. "There they are," Kahind whispered, pointing to the artifacts. "These are the source of the curse's power." Adunni stepped forward cautiously, her eyes locked on the relics. But before she could reach them, a figure emerged from the shadows behind the altar. It was Chief Olayinka, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "You're too late," Olayinka sneered, stepping into the dim light. "Did you really think you could stop me? The curse was never meant to be broken, it was meant to be harnessed. And now, thanks to you, the ritual is nearly complete." Adunni's grip tightened on her knife. "I won't let you use me for your twisted plans," she spat. "I will end this curse, even if it means taking you down with it." Olayinka's laughter filled the chamber, cold and mocking. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said. "This curse is tied to your bloodline. It will live on as long as you do. The only way to truly end it is to destroy the vessel." His gaze bore into hers, a cruel smile curling his lips. "And that vessel, dear Adunni, is you." Adunni's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down her spine. "I'm not afraid to die," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "If that's what it takes to stop you, then so be it." But before she could move, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The relics on the altar pulsed with a dark energy that filled the room, causing the walls to vibrate. Adunni could feel the curse tightening around her, the darkness clawing at her mind, threatening to pull her under. Kahind turned to her, panic in his eyes. "We have to destroy the artifacts now, before he completes the ritual," he shouted over the rumbling. Without wasting another second, Adunni lunged toward the altar. But just as her hand reached for the blood-stained dagger, a powerful force threw her back. She crashed into the wall, pain exploding in her ribs. Olayinka's laughter echoed through the chamber. "Did you think it would be that easy?" he taunted, raising his staff. The air crackled with dark energy as tendrils of shadow snaked out from the relics, wrapping around Adunni's limbs, pinning her to the ground. "Kahind!" Adunni screamed, struggling against the dark tendrils. "Destroy the artifacts." Kahind hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting between Adunni and Olayinka. Then, with a look of fierce determination, he sprinted toward the altar. But Olayinka was faster. With a flick of his staff, a wave of energy sent Kahind sprawling to the ground. The shadows holding Adunni tightened their grip, pulling her closer to the altar. She could feel the curse burrowing deeper into her, trying to consume her soul. Desperation fueled her. She couldn't let it end this way, not after everything she had fought for. Gritting her teeth, Adunni closed her eyes and focused on the anger and pain that had fueled her for so long. The memories of her father's betrayal, the villagers' cruelty, and the deaths caused by the curse surged through her like a firestorm. And then, just as she was about to be swallowed by the darkness, she found something unexpected, a spark of light. Forgiveness. The words of the spirits echoed in her mind. "Let go of your hatred, or the curse will consume you." Adunni's eyes snapped open. She understood now. The curse was tied not just to her blood, but to the anger and hatred she carried. If she wanted to break it, she had to let go. With a primal scream, she forced herself to release the hatred she had held onto for so long. The shadows around her shuddered, loosening their grip. She reached deep into herself, pulling forth every ounce of strength she had left, and in one final act of defiance, she tore free from the tendrils. "Behind, now," she shouted. Kahind didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed the blood-stained dagger from the altar and drove it into the bowl of dark liquid. The relics shattered in a burst of light, and the chamber was filled with a deafening roar as the dark magic was released. Alayinka screamed, clutching his chest as the dark energy turned on him, consuming him from the inside out. The ground shook violently, and the walls of the temple began to collapse. "Adunni, we have to go," Kahind yelled, pulling her to her feet. They sprinted toward the exit as the temple crumbled around them. The earth beneath them cracked open, and beams of moonlight pierced through the collapsing ceiling. Just as they reached the entrance, a final explosion of light erupted from the temple, sending them flying into the underbrush. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, Adunni opened her eyes to find herself lying on the forest floor, the night sky glittering above. The oppressive weight of the curse was gone. She could feel it, she was finally free. Kahind was beside her, bruised but alive. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You broke the curse." Adunni nodded, tears streaming down her face. The nightmare was over, but the cost had been great. As she looked back at the smoldering ruins of the temple, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. But for the first time in her life, she was free. And that, she realized, was worth everything. The forest was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the temple's collapse. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the charred ruins. Adunni lay on the cold forest floor, trying to steady her breath. The pain in her ribs from the earlier battle was still sharp, but it was nothing compared to the relief she felt. The dark weight that had pressed on her soul for so long was finally gone. The curse, it seemed, was broken. Kahind knelt beside her, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Adunni nodded, though her body trembled with exhaustion. "I'm free," she whispered, almost not believing it herself. "The curse, it's over." Kahind's face softened with relief, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to melt away. But as the forest settled into silence, a distant sound broke through the calm, a low rumbling that sent a chill down Adunni's spine. "What is that?" Kahind asked, his eyes darting around. Adunni pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the pain. The ground beneath them was trembling, and the air was filled with a strange hum, like 1,000 voices whispering at once. She turned to face the ruins of the temple, where a faint, ghostly light was beginning to swirl around the remnants of the altar. "No," she murmured, realization dawning on her. "It's not over yet." Before she could react, a dark figure rose from the center of the ruins, its form flickering like a shadow caught in a violent storm. The sorceress, Alayinka's mother. Her spirit had been lying in wait, feeding on the dark magic that had been released when the artifacts were destroyed. "You fools," the sorceress hissed, her voice like nails scraping against glass. "You may have destroyed the relics, but the curse is bound to my spirit. And now that I am free, I will complete the ritual myself." Adunni's heart sank. She had been so focused on breaking the curse through the artifacts that she hadn't realized the true source of the curse was the sorceress's lingering spirit. The temple's destruction had only set her free. Kahind grabbed Adunni's arm, panic in his eyes. "We have to run," he urged. "We're no match for her." But Adunni shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Running won't stop her. She'll keep coming after me, after the village, until she's taken everything." Her voice was steady, but inside, she was terrified. She had no weapons left, no tricks up her sleeve. But she couldn't let the sorceress win. The sorceress floated closer, her eyes glowing with malevolent glee. "You cannot escape your fate, child," she taunted. "You were destined to be my vessel. Your father's betrayal sealed your fate." Adunni's fists clenched. "I am not my father," she shouted. "And I will not be used by you any longer." The sorceress laughed, a sound that sent a shiver down Adunni's spine. "You cannot break the bond that ties us. It is your blood that fuels my power. And now I will drain the last of it." As the sorceress raised her hands, dark tendrils of energy shot toward Adunni, wrapping around her arms and legs. She gasped in pain as the life was slowly drained from her, her strength ebbing away like water through a sieve. Kahind looked on in horror. "Adunni," he cried, rushing forward. But a force field threw him back, slamming him against a tree. The sorceress smiled cruelly. "You are nothing but a pawn, boy. This has always been between me and the girl." Adunni struggled against the dark energy holding her, her mind racing. She could feel the sorceress's magic burrowing into her, feeding on her life force. The pain was excruciating, but through the agony, a single thought broke through. "The curse is tied to my blood. If I end myself..." Her heart lurched at the thought, but she knew it was the only way. The curse, the sorceress, everything was tied to her existence. If she could break that bond, she could end this once and for all. "Kahind," she screamed, her voice barely a whisper over the roar of dark magic. "I need your help." He struggled to his feet, his face a mask of anguish. "What do you need?" he called, his voice choked with desperation. Adunni's eyes locked onto his. "You have to kill me. It's the only way to stop her." Kahind's face went pale. "No, I can't do that. There has to be another way." "There isn't." Adunni shouted, her strength fading fast. The sorceress's energy was wrapping tighter around her, the darkness seeping into her very bones. "If you don't, she'll destroy everything. Please, Kahind, you have to do it." Tears filled Kahind's eyes, but he nodded, his face twisted with agony. With trembling hands, he reached for the blood-stained dagger that had fallen to the ground. "I'm so sorry, Adunni," he whispered, stepping closer. Adunni closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Do it," she whispered. "For the village, for all of us." Kahind hesitated for a moment, then, with a pained cry, he plunged the dagger into Adunni's heart. A burst of light erupted from her, so bright that it blinded him. The sorceress screamed, her dark form dissolving into the air as the bond was severed. The ground shook, the air filled with the roar of magic unraveling. Adunni's body slumped to the ground, and the forest fell silent. Kahind knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face as he held her lifeless body. The curse was broken, the sorceress banished, but the cost had been too great. He had lost her, lost the one person he had come to care for more than anything. As he wept, the faint glow of moonlight enveloped Adunni's body, and a soft whisper filled the air. "Thank you," the voice seemed to say, gentle as a breeze. "You freed me." Kahind looked up, his heart heavy with grief. The moon was full, casting its silver light over the forest. In that moment, he understood. Adunni's sacrifice had not only broken the curse, but had also set her spirit free. She was no longer bound by the darkness that had plagued her family for generations. The villagers would never know the true story of what had happened here, but Kahind knew. And as he carried her body back to the village, he vowed to honor her memory. She had given her life to save them all, and he would make sure her sacrifice was never forgotten. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The curse was gone, the village was safe, but for Kahind, the world would never be the same. The price of freedom had been paid in blood, and all that remained was the hope that the darkness would never return. The sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but the village was still shrouded in an uneasy silence. The full moon had passed, yet the air was thick with the weight of what had transpired the night before. Kahind trudged toward the village square, cradling Adunni's lifeless body in his arms. His steps were slow and heavy, each one a reminder of the price they had paid to break the curse. The villagers, who had spent the night in a state of anxious anticipation, emerged from their homes one by one. As they saw Kahind approaching, their expressions shifted from curiosity to horror. Whispers rippled through the crowd like the wind through leaves. "It's over," Kahind called out, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and grief. "The curse is broken. The sorceress has been defeated." Chief Alayinka, bruised and battered from the temple's collapse, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His face twisted with disbelief as he took in the sight of Adunni's limp form in Kahind's arms. "What have you done?" he demanded, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. Kahind met his gaze, his expression steely. Adunni sacrificed herself to save us all. She broke the curse that you tried to harness for your own gain. Gasps erupted from the villagers. Chief Olayinka's face paled as the truth of Kahind's words sank in. The villagers turned toward the chief, their faces hardening with anger and betrayal. The realization that they had been manipulated sent a murmur of dissent through the crowd. "You knew," one of the elders said, stepping forward with trembling hands. "You knew that she was the key to ending this, but you used us, used her." Olayinka opened his mouth to protest, but the crowd had already turned against him. They surged forward, their fear now transformed into righteous fury. Kahind held up a hand to stop them. "Enough," he shouted. "There has been enough bloodshed. Let her death not be in vain." The villagers hesitated, the fire in their eyes dimming. Kahind's voice softened as he continued, "Adunni gave her life to protect us. The least we can do is honor her sacrifice by letting go of the hatred and fear that nearly destroyed us." Silence fell over the square, broken only by the quiet sobbing of those who had lost loved ones to the curse. Chief Olayinka, seeing the tide turn irrevocably against him, dropped to his knees, his head bowed in defeat. Kahind turned away from the chief, his focus now on the task at hand. He gently laid Adunni's body on the ground and knelt beside her. "She was more than just a scapegoat for your fears," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "She was the one who saved you, even when you turned your backs on her." A soft breeze stirred through the square, lifting the strands of Adunni's hair like a gentle caress. The villagers watched in silent awe as the first rays of sunlight touched her face, bathing her in a golden glow. It was as if the land itself was acknowledging her sacrifice, the darkness that had plagued the village finally lifting with the dawn. After a moment of quiet reverence, the villagers came together to prepare for a proper burial. They carried Adunni's body to the hill overlooking the village, where the soil was soft and the wildflowers grew thick. It was the same hill where her father had once been buried, now a place where she could finally find peace. Kahind stood at the head of the gathering, his heart heavy with loss. As the villagers laid Adunni to rest, he spoke softly, his voice carrying on the morning breeze. "Adunni was a light in the darkness," he said. "She carried a burden that none of us could understand, yet she chose to protect us despite everything." Tears streamed down the faces of the villagers, their guilt and sorrow spilling out in quiet sobs. They had been wrong to judge her, to believe the lies that had been spread by Olayinka and the elder who had sought to manipulate them. Now, as they laid her to rest, they finally understood the weight of their mistakes. When the burial was complete, the villagers slowly made their way back to their homes, their hearts lighter, but their minds filled with the lessons they had learned. Kahind remained by Adunni's grave, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. "You should be at peace now," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I don't know how to move on from this." As he stood there, lost in his grief, a soft breeze swept across the hilltop, carrying with it a faint whisper. Kahind's eyes widened as he heard her voice, so soft, so gentle, like a dream. "You freed me, Kahind. You gave me peace." Kahind fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I wish I could have saved you," he whispered to the wind. "I wish I could have done more." But the whisper came again, lighter this time, like a caress. "You did enough. Live your life, Kahind. Be free as I am now." The wind died down, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of birdsong. Kahind wiped his tears, a sense of peace settling over him. He had lost much, but he had gained something far more precious, a purpose to live on, to honor Adunni's sacrifice by protecting the village she had given her life to save. As the days turned into weeks, the village slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The curse was gone, and with it, the fear that had gripped their hearts. Chief Olayinka was stripped of his position and sent into exile, the villagers choosing new leaders who would guide them with wisdom and compassion. Kahind, now seen as a hero for his role in breaking the curse, refused any position of power. Instead, he chose to live quietly, tending to the land and helping rebuild the village. But every evening, as the sun set, he would climb the hill where Adunni was buried, a single wildflower in hand. One evening, as he stood by her grave, he noticed a small, delicate flower blooming where she had been laid to rest. It was unlike any he had ever seen, a deep, vibrant red that seemed to glow in the fading light. He smiled, a bittersweet feeling blooming in his chest. "Thank you," he whispered, placing the flower beside her grave. "For everything." As he turned to leave, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter. For the first time in what felt like years, Kahine smiled, a real, genuine smile. Adunni's story had ended, but her spirit would forever watch over the village, a guardian who had given everything to protect the people she loved. The darkness had been banished, and in its place, a new dawn had come. And though Kahine's heart would forever carry the scars of loss, he knew that wherever she was, Adunni had found the peace she deserved.